Welcome to this edition of Cranmer's Readings. We are with Professor MacCulloch, and we're in the time period of 1542-53, the Prebendaries Plot. As we noted, it had been failing due to decisive, coordinated action. There were some small bit reform players scooped up, but Cranmer was the one who was in the sights. Bishop Winchester said he'd give £6,000 if they could bring down Cranmer to any man. Bishop Dr. London, Wily Winchester, Dr. Willoughby, Robert Searles, and others are able to get a set of articles alleging heresy on the part of Thomas Cranmer going back to 1541 and bringing us up to the date of March and Passion Week of 1543. And now it was that Henry knew who was the biggest heretic in Kent. Game on. Events began to mirror what happened when Cranmer had delivered his denunciation of Queen Catherine Howard to Henry VIII. A highly confidential investigation needed to be set up in a very great hurry. Immediately, Dean Wotton of Canterbury issued a secret and urgent summons up to the capital to his conservative prebendaries. They must bring signed copies of their articles. The prebendaries arrived on 23 April 1543. Certain counselors gave them much encouragement, principally Sir John Baker, their chief contact now in charge of the Kent investigation, who was liaising closely with Bishop Gardiner, and who openly told them that King Henry himself had authorized the inquiry. Baker was an old associate of the Warham Circle, who'd already headed Maurice's list of conservative Kentish JPs who had heard the accusations against Richard Turner a month before. And it was perhaps Baker who prevailed on Sir Thomas Moyle to change his mind about Turner's sermon and pursue the accusation against him in London after Easter week. At this stage, Cranmer was naturally ignorant of the very serious turn of events in Baker's investigative initiative. And in public, he was still holding his own against the conservatives. When his commissioners at Lambeth did indeed meet to discuss the Turner case, they sent the parson of Chartham home with a clean bill of spiritual health, much to conservative fury. Cranmer's commissioners were also investigating a parallel complaint in late April against his protege Humphrey of St. Alphegis of Canterbury, and Chartham received a similar sympathetic treatment from them. Prebendary Gardiner urged Sir John Baker to take control of this alarming loose end in the conservative plans, and Dr. London was annoyed that Sir Thomas Moyle was still feeding the accusations sent by the Kentish JPs to Cranmer's commissioners. Yet the Archbishop's concern for his inferiors may have been distracting him from the mounting campaign that was coming against him. Meanwhile, there was a much greater distraction, indeed a major blow for the Archbishop. When Convocation had fully reconvened on 20 April 1543, yet another highly important front was opened against the religious battleground over the Easter break. This was the long-last revision of the bishop's book to provide a new doctrinal statement for the Church of England. Between 20 and 30 April, successive sessions of Convocation examined the new texts for the book, section by section, with Cranmer presiding over the subcommittees on the Lord's Prayer, Hail Mary, 10 Commandments, Creed, and the Sacraments. These were no mere formal or nominal examinations. In a later mischievous reminiscence, Bishop Gardiner preserved an account of Cranmer's defeat on 27 April on the roll of salvation, a reminiscence which seemed confirmed in accuracy by its outcome in the text of the book. Appalled at the draft's rejection of justification by faith alone, Cranmer in his speech tried a perhaps over-ingenious image to argue faith's unique role. He pointed out that sight was the property of the eye, yet these did not deny the presence of the nose on the face. Similarly, justification was the property of faith, which was not to deny the company of other virtues with faith. Clearly failing to impress his colleagues with this, he fell back on a rather fine distinction of saying that he would accept the text denying faith alone, but not faith only, and then made the mistake of appealing to Henry VIII as a referee. With the Kent accusations fresh in his mind, the king was not disposed to be sympathetic to the greatest heretic in Kent. The eventual text of the published statement ended up starting pitilessly that justification meant faith neither only or alone. On the key theological issue, Henry had not moved on from his earlier insistence on the place of works in salvation against Cranmer's earnest protestations and persuasions in 1538. By the beginning of May, the new statement of official doctrine was ready for publication, and on May 5, in what must have been a rather tedious ceremony, it was solemnly read to the nobility of the realm in the council chamber. Once this work had been completed, convocation stood down for the rest of the year. The book, entitled A Necessary Doctrine of Erudition for Any Christian Man, could be given the unambiguous nickname the King's Book, because its doctrine met with the king's wholehearted approval. In almost every respect, it was more doctrinally conservative than the bishop's book, the exception being in its highly dismissive treatment of purgatory. Samuel Lemberg rightly observes that the archbishop's main contribution was probably to tidy up the literary style, for overall the book is much more concise and better arranged than its predecessor. Otherwise, Cranmer must have deplored the changes made in it. As we will see, although for the moment he was forced to accept the royal verdict, he made his own plans to correct its faults in the future, especially on the central theme of justification, faith, and works. While Cranmer was thus occupied in knotty arguments about final wordings and doctrine, it was the perfect moment for the web of conservative accusations to be woven even more tightly, and there are complex accounts of frantic comings and goings between Bishop Gardiner, Sir John Baker, the Canterbury clergy, and in Oxford, Robert Searles, all through the latter part of April and the first week of May. On 4 May 1543, Dr. London predicted the General Commission to extirpate heresy throughout the realm within short space. Indeed, Baker, in the presence of Prebendary Gardiner and 6 preachers, Shether, drew up a list of 13 names suitable for the Kent Commission. They included Dr. John Leff, master of Maidstone College. One can gauge where Leff would have stood in the Kent stirs by salient features of his career. A Winchester College boy who'd been a contemporary of Dr. London at New College, a former fellow of Canterbury College, Oxford, and Vicar General to Archbishop William. In the event, Cranmer was present at the Privy Council meeting of 4 May, at which the issue of a special commission to examine religious enormities in Kent was recommended to the king for his consideration. His presence suggests a hesitation fatal for the Conservatives. The king had absorbed the information about Cranmer, but he was not prepared to strike against him personally. Despite the uncertainties of the rest of the year, this may have been the moment at which Cranmer was in fact safe. Moreover, the committee set up at the same meeting to examine Dean Haynes was not unduly fearsome, containing as it did, apart from traditionalist Bishop Salcott, Haynes' old Cambridge friends Bishops Goodrich, Heath, and Thirlby. The next blow, only 4 days later, however, showed that the king was deeply impressed by the information which the Conservatives had fed him and was still interested in playing the orthodox monarch for the benefit of Charles V and his diplomats. The setting of events from this time on is significant. Convocation played little part, being repeatedly prorogued while Parliament continued to sit. Probably it had shown itself too reformist during the winter, and the new Conservative program was going to be steered more securely through Parliament, where Cranmer and his officials were deprived of the procedural control which they could exercise in the Convocation House. A bill was introduced to the House of Lords on May 8 about the printing of books, one of the chief concerns of the Privy Council during April. The title is non-committal enough, but its content was clearly controversial. Stanford Lemberg notes the very unusual proceeding that afternoon of a separate meeting of the bishops, which can only have been convened to discuss this measure. As it progressed through its parliamentary stages, the nature of the bill became clearer. On 10 May, it was described as being for the abolishment of erroneous books, and its final form only 2 days later as an act with royal assent for the advancement of true religion. The measure was the bitterest blow for the evangelicals. It was the first actual turning back of the Cromwellian tide of reforms, in a way that even the 6 Articles had not been. It contained remarkable provisions for an attempt to restrict Bible reading on a status basis. The central activity of the godly life was prohibited to householders under the level of yeomen, all dependents and servants and all women, except hastily added women of gentle or noble status. It makes a striking contrast with Cranmer's Convocation enactment of February for English Bible readings at the church services. Even if Cranmer did not speak out about the measure, his Kentish subordinates were less circumspect. The very day after Parliament was prorogued with the measure passed, evangelical sex preacher Michael Drum stood up in Canterbury Cathedral pulpit and declared roundly that those who went about to take away the reading of the Bible were about to pluck Christ's words and the Holy Ghosts from the people. The restriction of Bible reading reflects Henry's concerns about its abuse, which we have seen repeatedly surface since the first authorization in 1538. And the whole measure was clearly a reflection of his current mood and intentions in both domestic religious policy and overseas diplomacy. Yet at the same time, commentators discerned the hand of Bishop Gardiner in the enactment. Certainly only 3 days later, Gardiner wrote in imperious triumph to his vice-chancellor of Cambridge that the king hath, by the inspiration of the Holy Ghost, componed all matters of religion, among which he regarded his own year-old adjudication on the pronunciation of Greek as not the least. We have one record of Gardiner's direct influence on the king at this time. The accusation which he relayed to Henry from the conservative Kentish clergy that Richard Turner had transformed his journey home to Chartham from Lambeth discharge into a triumphal progress. Only an urgent letter from Ralph Maurice to his court contacts averted the implementation of the king's angry letter to Cranmer that Turner should be ceremonially whipped out of the country. There can be no doubt that we should see the act of the advancement of true religion as the lasting outcome of the great gathering of information against evangelicals in Windsor, the capital, and Kent, which Wily Winchester and Dean London had spent so much time coordinating. From May to August, evangelicals continued to be examined and imprisoned. Of 3 leading evangelicals forced into a humiliating recantation in the capital at the beginning of July, 2, Thomas Beacon and Richard Singleton, operated mainly in Kent, Singleton possibly as an undercover agent for Cranmer's overseas business, and a third, Robert Wisdom, was a close associate of theirs with a ministry in Essex and London. One conservative magnate who seems to have begun taking an interest in the Kentish troubles from mid-May onwards was Duke of Norfolk. He had perhaps up till now been keeping out of the witch hunt because of the embarrassment that was his son, the Earl of Surrey, had been caught up in accusations against fashionable young men with evangelical sympathies. Soon after Whit Sunday, 13 May, however, Norfolk was presented with one of the sets of the Kentish accusations, and Cranmer's enemies were thus powerfully augmented. Nevertheless, for the most part, the Kentish denunciations continued to be fielded not by the Duke, but by Bishop Gardiner and Sir John Baker, mostly via Baker's servant Cyriac Petit, a lifelong conservative and later founder of the Catholic recusant dynasty, who happened conveniently also to be the Duke Deputy Clerk of Peace in Kent. One of the most lurid surviving sets, however, bypassed Petit and was addressed directly to Gardiner from the pen of Edmund Shether, 6th preacher of the Cathedral and Fellow of All Souls, Oxford. This includes a charge of bigamy against Cranmer's sister and a veiled but unmistakable insinuation of buggery by the hated commissary Neverson, one of Cranmer's kitchen boys. The agenda of all this was underlined at the end of May by one of the most unpleasant incidents of the whole tale of ill will in the mother church of the province of Canterbury. Cranmer's long-standing chaplain and evangelical stalwart, amongst the cathedral prebendaries, Dr. Richard Champion, died in late May. At the end of his funeral in the cathedral, the bell ringer seized the censer from the thurifer and poured the hot coals over the new grave before the astonishing gaze of the dispersing congregation. In his eyes, Champion was an unrepentant heretic. We will shift now to Dr. Ridley at a different time frame. 6 years later, in 1549, entitled The Revolts of 1549. And we noted last time that we hear of mishmash-ups between the traditionalists and Cranmer on the Eucharist. Cranmer and Ridley gave a full-throated defense of the Reformed view 14 to 18 December. Ridley notes that Somerset, Dorset, and Warwick and Northampton had, in the same context, denounced the Romanist Mass, and that the political context may have given Cranmer collateral fire support for his parliamentary statement. Also, the Book of Common Prayer was discussed by divines at Windsor Castle and Chertsey, with even trads agreeing to the vernacular book. But trouble was still in the air with a new calendar and some other details of Holy Communion, including the prohibition of elevation of the host. But up and down, the larger objection was from the populace. They didn't want the English vernacular, they wanted their Latin book, their Latin Mass back. Tensions were high amongst the population, not to mention the traditionalist bishops. And Cranmer apparently was rather shocked by the reaction of the people. And we pick up with chapter 19, the Revolts of 1549. In March 1549, Thomas Seymour, the Lord Admiral, was alleged to have plotted to overthrow his brother, the Protector, was beheaded for high treason under the provisions of the Act of Attainder. It has been suggested that there was something new and improper in the fact that Cranmer, as a priest, signed Seymour's death warrant. But the ecclesiastical members of the council had often joined in authorizing executions in the days of Henry VIII, and Cranmer had less to do with Seymour's execution than might have been expected. He signed the minutes of the meeting of the council when the first accusation of treason was made against Seymour in January 1549, but he had nothing more to do with the case until 2 months later, when he had again signed the minutes, along with Somerset and 12 other councillors, at a meeting where it was decided that Seymour should be beheaded 3 days after Goodrich had visited him to give him his final spiritual assistance. Cranmer was expressly accepted from the rest of the council when they entrusted themselves of the duty of interrogating Seymour in the Tower. And there's no record of his denouncing Seymour in violent sermons of the kind which Latimer had preached. Peter Martyr, who was residing in Oxford but was in constant communication with Cranmer, wrote to Bucer in January that it was a tragedy that a man as friendly to the Reformation as Seymour should have fallen into such misfortune, though he was sure that his offense was grave. Cranmer probably held the same opinion. Cranmer now had to deal with the Anabaptists. In December 1548, he had compelled a Lincolnshire parson who denied the Trinity and divinity of Christ to recant and do public penance. And in April and May 1549, he presided over a commission which dealt with other heretics. Chapnays of Stratford had preached that some men were the elect of God who were unable to sin once they had received the Holy Spirit and were entitled to seize all things necessary for their bodily requirements. Puto, the Colchester tanner, believed that Christ had not descended into hell. Thom, a London butcher, believed that Christ took no flesh of the Virgin and denied the value of baptism. And Joan Botcher, who was probably Thom's wife, asserted the same heresy, that Christ was the spiritual seed, but not the natural seed of the Virgin. All the men recanted and carried their faggots at St. Paul's Cross, though Puto and Thom were insufficiently penitent, were brought before Cranmer again and made to do their penance a second time. Joan Botcher refused to recant, and so on 30 April, Cranmer excommunicated the woman whom he had falsely accused of shielding by the Prebendaries of Canterbury 6 years before. The heresy of the statues had been repealed in 1547, and there was more than a year's delay before the council, having assured themselves of the legality of burning heretics independently of the statute under common law, sent Joan to the fire at Smithfield on 2 May 1550. Fox attributed to Cranmer the direct responsibility for the burning of Joan Botcher. He described the reluctance of the young king to sign the warrant for her execution, both on account of his natural kindness, because he did not wish to send Joan to the devil by burning her before she had repented. As the council could not induce Edward to sign, they sent Cranmer to persuade him, and Cranmer eventually succeeded. And Edward had said that before God he would place the responsibility for his action on Cranmer. Cranmer later said that he had never in his life had a more difficult task than persuading Edward to burn Joan Botcher. It was not until the 19th century that Cranmer's admirers thought it necessary to deny the truth of Fox's story. But when public opinion had come to prefer a martyr who was not also a persecutor, it was strenuously argued that Cranmer may have done whatever Cranmer may have done in the case of Frith and Lambert. He was not responsible for persuading Edward to burn Joan Botcher. 3 arguments are put forward to prove this. The first, that Edward expressed no regret at Joan's execution when he recorded the fact in his journal. Second, that the warrant for the execution was signed by the council and not by Edward. And thirdly, that Cranmer was not present at the council meeting on 27 April 1550 when the decision was taken to burn Joan. The fact that Edward showed no sign of regret in his journal is not surprising, for apart from the fact that all his entries are very brief, his reference to Joan Botcher is entered under 2 May 1550, the date of her execution, which according to Fox's story was after he had persuaded to consent to her death. The other points are more weighty and seem to prove that Fox, on the occasion as on many others, was wrong on points of detail. But it's unlikely that he invented the whole story, even though he was one of the few persons in the 16th century who had doubts as to the propriety of burning, even Anabaptists, and probably intended his story of Edward's reluctance to burn Joan Botcher to serve as propaganda against burning heretics. The story, moreover, first appeared in the second edition of Fox's Blood of Martyrs, after Fox had met Maurice and learned a great deal from him about Cranmer. It was obviously unnecessary for Cranmer to persuade Edward to sign the warrant, which was issued by the council. But Edward may well have been disturbed when he heard that the burnings of Smithfield, which he had been taught to view with horror, were about to start again. And if Edward was objecting to burning Joan Bocher, the council would certainly have been anxious to persuade her that her death was necessary. Cranmer was by far the most suitable counselor to be chosen to explain to Edward that while it was evil of papists to burn Christians whom they falsely accused of heresy, it was the duty of the Christian king to punish offenses against God as resolutely as he punished offenses against himself, and to send those who were in fact heretics to the flames. In view of Fox's story, there's every reason to believe that Cranmer persuaded Edward to the burning of John Bocher, that it was justified. The Book of Common Prayer came into force at Whitsunday. Next day, the disorders broke out in Devonshire, and within a month, the council was confronted with a conservative religious revolt in the west, with an agrarian insurrection in Norfolk and riots against enclosures all over the southeast of England. Cranmer played an active part in directing the measures taken for the suppression of the disturbances, and along with Somerset, Paulet, Rich, and secretaries Peter and Thomas Smith, signed the constant instructions sent to Russell in Devonshire, promising to send him more German mercenaries and urging him to use severity. Cranmer also wrote a reply to the Western rebels' petition to the king, as did Somerset, in the king's name, and Nicholas Udall, the disgraced headmaster of Eton. Udall and Somerset pointed out the foolishness of the rebels' demands, and that the consequences of gratifying them would be harmful to the interests of the rebels themselves. But Cranmer took a much higher tone and denounced the wickedness of the rebellion. His reply is marked throughout by a passionate indignation, which is largely absent from the answers of Somerset and Udall. The rebels' petition began by stating, "We will have all the general councils and holy decrees of our fathers observed, kept, and performed. And whosoever shall gainsay them, we hold them as heretics." Cranmer was incensed at the language. "Is this," he asked, "the fashion of subjects to speak unto their prince, we will have? Was the manner of speech at any time used of their subjects to their prince since the beginning of the world? Have not all true subjects ever used to their sovereign lord and king this form of speaking? Most humbly beseecheth your humble and obedient servants." He then told them that the holy decrees of our forefathers were papist, and that if they believed them, they were heretics and traitors. The rebels demanded the restoration of the 6 Articles. Cranmer replied that the 6 Articles were introduced by the evil council of papists, and were so far from the truth they would never have passed in Parliament if Henry had not come in person to the House of Lords. It is strange that Cranmer should have gone even as far as this in blaming Henry for the 6 Articles, though he hastened to add that within a little more than a year, the most noble prince moderated the statute, so that the Act of 6 Articles remained in force for little more than a year. This last statement, as Cranmer knew well, was untrue, but the rest of his reply to the rebels on the point shows that for Cranmer the 6 Articles meant primarily the persecution of married priests, which had not continued for long after 1539. Cranmer certainly did not intend that his reference to Henry's presence in Parliament during the debates on the 6 Articles should be cited as it was in 1681 by the opponents of royal power, as if Cranmer in this polemic against rebellion had been protecting the overawing of Parliament by the king. The rebels wished to have the Mass in Latin, with only the priest communicating, and communion only at Easter and only in one kind. Cranmer told them that they should wish to understand what was said in the Mass and favor frequent communion of all people. They demanded that the sacrament be hung over the altar, that all who refused to worship it should die like heretics. But Cranmer wrote that this practice had only been introduced since the 13th century. As for their demand that baptism be celebrated every day and not only on Sundays, Cranmer pointed out this could always be done in cases of necessity, and that in the early church, children were only baptized at Easter and Whitsunday. Cranmer denounced as superstition and idolatry the rebels' demand for holy bread, holy water, palms, ashes, images, and all the old ceremonies. He lamented that when they were offered the heavenly bread of life in the sacrament, they refused it except at Easter, and the cup of the most holy blood they refused to drink at any time. And yet they wished to eat and drink holy bread and holy water, which were poisoned bread and stinking puddles of the Bishop of Rome. The rebels objected to the new liturgy in English because some of the Cornishmen could not understand English, but Cranmer was sure that even fewer of them understood Latin. Cranmer rejected the rebels' demands for prayers for souls in purgatory and for the suppression of the English Bible as the leading spread of heresies, and for the release of their leaders. But Cranmer compared to the Jews' demand for the release of Barabbas. They asked for Pole to be pardoned and made a member of the council because he was of royal blood. But Cranmer thought Pole was unworthy to live, for he had incited the emperor and French king to invade the realm. Cranmer ended by dealing with the rebels' social demands. It asked that a gentleman should only be allowed one servant for every 100 marks worth of land that he owned. Somerset and Udall had dealt with this demand by pointing out that it would cause unemployment, but Cranmer preferred the high moral tone. Was it ever seen in any country since the world began that the commons did appoint the nobles and gentlemen the number of their servants? Standeth it with any reason to turn upside down the good order of the whole world, that in everywhere and ever hath been, that is to say, the commoners to be governed by the nobles, and the servants by their masters? Will you now have the subjects to govern their king, the villains to rule the gentlemen, and the servants their masters? If men would suffer this, God will not, but will take vengeance of all them that break his order, as he did Dathan and Abiram. We call that to a close. Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.